I think we can get started, so maybe people will still be coming in, but hopefully that's okay with everybody. So thank you so much for coming to my presentation. My name is Olga. I come from the University of Nottingham, and as you can see, the presentation is going to be on Derrida and EAP and how deconstruction can support the development of EAP learners' critical thinking and reading skills. I'll start timing myself just to make sure that I stay on track. So the presentation, or what I would like to do, is I would like to begin by briefly defining the current debate about critical thinking. What is it? I'll then go on to very briefly discuss the impact of deconstruction on other disciplines outside of EAP, and also will attempt a very brief definition of deconstruction, and I do say attempt. The main part of the presentation is going to focus on three deconstructive moves or tools that I think we can use usefully in an EAP classroom to develop critical thinking and critical reading skills. And the three tools that I'll try and do justice to are presence versus absence, and I'll relate that to the way we teach self-reference and integral or author-prominent citations. The second tool is repetition versus difference, and in relation to textual coherence or organizational patterns. And finally, I want to touch upon binary oppositions versus hierarchies and relate it to language or languages of science. And then, by way of a conclusion, I'll come back to my definition of deconstruction. So I'll start with what is critical thinking? Well, there is still a debate over a common definition, and there are sort of two main groups, the specifists versus the generalists. The crux of the debate has to do with prior knowledge. Do you need to have prior knowledge of a topic or a field of study in order to be able to exercise critical thinking or apply critical thinking to a topic or a field of study? The specifists say yes, prior knowledge is essential. You have to have an in-depth understanding of a topic before you can critically kind of approach it. For them, critical thinking is the reflective approach towards the knowledge one already has about the object of thought. But, of course, the generalists view it in a very different way. So the generalist approach is to think of critical thinking as a kind of a useful critical thinking toolbox, which is sort of a generic toolbox. And when I say toolbox, I'm thinking of things like, you can do critical thinking without prior knowledge. It depends on how you do it or what you do. For the generalists, critical thinking is really about being able to identify assumptions, being able to evaluate evidence or the quality of argument, being able to understand and talk about implications and causation, and perhaps most importantly, it's about being open-minded to the possibility of reaching a different conclusion. So the generalists maintain that in order to do all these things, you don't necessarily have to have prior in-depth knowledge of a topic. And I think that in a way, the kind of generic toolbox of the generalists is pretty close to what we do with our students in a lot of cases. And it's specifically the last kind of being open-minded to the possibility of alternatives and alternative understandings or reaching a different conclusion that we try to encourage our students to have, which I think is what critical thinking is really all about. So it is this last important ability to be open-minded that I would argue can be encouraged if we use a deconstructive approach in an EAP classroom when we ask our students to think about and to read texts critically. So in terms of deconstruction, first I'll just briefly mention the impact of deconstruction on other disciplines. So obviously the deconstruction is it belongs in the field of philosophy. It's been incredibly influential. I have to admit, more influential in my part of the world, which is North America, than in France. Americans love deconstruction. But it also changed the discipline of literary studies. It had an impact on the study of music. There are whole journals dedicated to the study of deconstruction and the study of culture, contemporary culture. Deconstruction, interestingly enough, changed and had quite an impact on the religious studies and also on the study of psychoanalysis. And I love this example. It's really recent. I was super excited when I came across it. Deconstruction also affected the study of art. So this is a recent example where you can see Ai Weiwei linking deconstruction, language, and human consciousness when he talks about his own reimagining of Monet's water lilies with Lego bricks. Now, I'll return to this example in a few minutes, but you can see how deconstruction becomes part of kind of the art zeitgeist, if you like. So what is it, if it's so influential? Well, I was quite happy that Guy made the first very brave attempt to define it. Yes, it's synonymous with Derrida, who's a French philosopher, and even his close friends referred to him as an intellectual terrorist. He is famous for his elusive writing style. Maybe it's something to do with French, but even in very good translations, it is elusive, and that's a generous way of putting it. The word itself, deconstruction, is not a word that Derrida coined. He revived it, he didn't invent it, and it is notoriously hard to define. So Derrida himself resisted all attempts to kind of pin him down and says, okay, tell us, what is it? So that's a famous quote. He says, what is it? Well, everything, nothing, not very helpful. And in an article, again, very famous article he gave to the New York Times, he said, well, if I try to define it, I'll be utterly unsatisfied, which is, the case for all of us, really. So what I would suggest for our purposes today is, instead of trying to represent what it is, let's think about how to do it, right? So performing over representing. And when we perform deconstruction, what we're doing is textual analysis, a type of textual critique, an act of reflective reading, or, if you like, all of the above. So when we do deconstructive readings, the aim is really to focus on textual analysis, textual coherence, and look at textual contradictions and structural distinctions. It is not about kind of violently dismembering the text. It is really about showing that the text has always already kind of dismembered itself. So in terms of linking deconstruction to encouraging students to be more critical or kind of enhancing their critical thinking and critical reading skills, the several tools I think deconstruction can offer, and these are the three tools that I have time to talk about today. So the first tool is thinking about presence versus absence, and it's really about noticing and questioning what is excluded or marginalized in texts that we study. The second tool is repetition versus difference, and it's about noticing and questioning departures from or contradictions within organizational patterns and structural repetition. And the final tool is the noticing and questioning of binary oppositions, which actually are not oppositions at all. They're really hierarchies. So I will start by saying a few more words about presence versus absence, and I specifically want to relate it to the kind of bread and butter of EAP, which is referencing. So we obviously teach our students the mechanics of referencing, right? The kind of dominant patterns of referencing, and we also teach them how to present themselves when they write. So we offer advice on the use or non-use of the dreaded first-person pronoun. And the use of I in a text, whether when they write or when they read, is important, not just because it's kind of a shortcut to avoid using passive, right, which students often struggle with, but it is because using I is a way for a writer to construct their own identity in a text and to really kind of take ownership of what is written. Now, historically, obviously, first-person pronoun is something that is very much excluded from academic writing, right? And I've given a couple of quotes that rather unequivocally say, you know, it's like the opposite of Nike. Don't do it, right? Avoid first person. And this is the kind of historical advice. But even more recently, Hyland, perhaps less unequivocally, but still suggests that, you know, in hard sciences, really, you should try to avoid the use of the first person pronoun. And he supports this claim with the data, showing us what actually we can see in the texts. Now, it's really interesting that, yes, the I is absent, but the we, the us, the our, are very much there, right? So, with the I, the we, and the our, even more recently, the APA and the American National Standard for the Preparation of Scientific Papers for Written and Oral Presentations actually have started recommending the use of I, especially for experimental design texts. So we may see more I than in the past. Now, similarly, and this is data from Morocco 2013. The data that I'm showing you relates to exclusion and inclusion of integral or author prominent citations in humanities and science dissertations. And you can see that there is both a degree of similarity between science dissertations and humanities dissertations, and there's some variation. Now, it is not clear-cut, but you could say that yes, in the humanities, the author prominent citations perhaps are more common than in the sciences. Now, the conclusion of Morocco's study are that there is versatility and actually variation. It's not just exclusion across the board. It's not also inclusion across the board. Morocco suggests that author prominent citations are subject to the influence of the community of practice in which the writing takes place. No surprises there, right? But the point that this particular study makes, and I think it's important to keep in mind, is that citations are not free from the values and the beliefs of their creators. And so when we teach self-referencing or referencing, it is important not to just teach the mechanics, right, but to also to try and interrogate the how and the why referencing is used, especially if it goes beyond the kind of general patterns. So in terms of kind of focused on presence versus absence, first person, we, I, author prominent, or information prominent. The kinds of questions that I think we should be asking together with our students to help them become more critical thinkers and also more critical readers of referencing patterns are the following. Of course, we have to think about the dominant pattern, right? And we have to teach students what is happening in their disciplines. But we could also go one step further and ask them to think about what is being excluded and why, right? And what does this exclusion actually tell us about the writer's identity and how writers either take a position or kind of find a way to evade taking responsibility for what they're writing. So that's presence versus absence, exclusion versus inclusion. Now, the second tool that I want to talk about is repetition versus difference, and I'll kind of link it to textual coherence. So we actually do a lot of work with repetition, even if we maybe don't say it out loud. So there's a helpful quote from Hyland that talks about genre analysis, right? And genre analysis is really about studying patterns and recurring features. So it's really about the study of repetition, right? So Hyland suggests that by studying recurring patterns and teaching our students to look for these recurring patterns, we can help them understand what the writers are trying to achieve and also the kind of language that they need in order to make the same kind of moves when they do their own writing. Now, scholars of repetition would say that this kind of repetition that Hyland describes, and we often do with our students, is the normative or kind of Platonic repetition, right? So it goes back to Plato's allegory of the cave, a story about how we receive knowledge. I don't know if you can see the picture of what happens in the allegory of the cave. I'm not going to kind of go through it. But essentially it's a story about imitation, right? It's about how do we get to know things. We get to know things through imitation of a kind of an archetypal model that is based on recollection of already existing knowledge. Essentially, it's all about repetition that stresses similarity or sameness. But, this kind of repetition gives rise to those kinds of tasks. So this is something that I often do with my postgraduate EAP students. I give them a selection of abstracts, I ask them to read the abstracts and identify the standard writer moves, right? And then guess what? The next step is apply it to your own writing, create your own abstract using the same kind of moves. So I hope I am not an outlier here in doing this. Good. So this is the Platonic repetition that we do a lot. But deconstruction actually introduces us or kind of gives us the different type of repetition, which is the Nietzschean repetition. It is a repetition that allows for reinvention. So it focuses on difference against the background of similarity. And if you think, well, what does that mean? Think about Ai Weiwei's Lego water lilies, right? It's same topic, the water lilies, but it's reinvented, it's Lego bricks. So this is also what I think, not being a mind reader, but interpreting what he is saying, Hyland means when more recently he talks about how actually when we do genre analysis and we teach or we look for recurring writer moves, actually what we see is less uniformity than you might expect. And Hyland rather unhelpfully says, this is because writers make different choices. Of course, the question is, well, why do they? Right? Why is it that the writers make these different choices from the kind of optional menu or buffet of choices that they have? So for EAP, if we want our students to become critical thinkers and we want them to be critical readers when it comes to textual coherence, I would say it would be a good idea to utilize both theories of repetition, not just the Platonic one, but the Nietzschean as well. So of course, with all of our students, we want to ask the question of, okay, what moves do we expect to see in the text? But then we have to actually be kind of honest and talk about what moves we actually see in a text. And think about, okay, which moves are absent, so that gets us back to presence absence again, but also which moves occur out of sequence, and what are the alternative moves that potentially the writers could have used, right? That's a more critical approach. And once you ask the question about, well, what alternative moves are out there, you have to think about, okay, well, why do the writers make the choices that they make, right? And how making a different choice can actually produce an alternative conclusion or alternative meaning. So moving on to the binary opposition, the final tool. For deconstruction, binary oppositions are really not binary oppositions. They are really hierarchies, with one set of terms always being privileged over the other. So deconstructive readings really kind of zoom in on these binary oppositions and try to unpack them as hierarchies and really show that the hierarchies sometimes are, socially constructed, not really based in anything quote-unquote real. So the two kind of binary oppositions that I would like to focus on are scientific versus non-scientific, non-figurative versus figurative. And I'm not going to try and suggest which set of terms is privileged, but I'm sure everyone kind of can make that call for yourself. So I want to focus specifically on these oppositions or hierarchies in relation to a recent study. It's from 2020, and it's a study of the language of science by Jacque and Derrida. So both of them are scientists, and they wrote this really interesting article about the languages of science, and they set up a binary opposition. They identified two languages that scientists use. The first is the official, which they call respectable language of science. They call it also the day language. So it's metaphor-free, it is precise, and it has to do with slow thinking. This is the language that our students encounter when they read scientific journals or when they go to conferences and listen to scientific presentations. But Jacque and Derrida also suggest that there is an unofficial language of science, and they call it the night language, making it sound really kind of illicit and exciting. And it's, of course, the language that is using metaphors, right, and using personification, so, selfish genes, stupid bacteria, or helpful bacteria. They say this language is kind of hazy and incomplete, and it's really there for fast thinking. So if you're a scientist and you have you're trying to work something out, this is the language that you rely on. And helpfully, they kind of give examples. So night science questions would be something like, why would the cell do something this stupid, right? Translated into day science language, it is, what is the mechanism? And for them, this is very much a binary opposition, okay? They give a table where they actually translate chunks of night language into, again, quote unquote, respectable day language. Now, as delightful as this is, of course, this binary opposition is very much a hierarchy, right? For them, to become a kind of a proper, respectable scientist, you have to jettison the night language, right, and translate everything into day language. However, as I'm sure everybody knows, there are many, many studies of the use of metaphors in scientific texts. And actually, if you look at scientific texts, academic journal articles, scientific conference presentations, it's not night versus day. It's more night as day, right? Or day is night. So scientists use metaphors, yes, as Jacque and Derrida admit, to conceptualize and name difficult or abstract new ideas, but they also use them in order to kind of present their own ideological assumptions and disciplinary attitudes and way of thinking. So I think if we are using scientific texts with our students and we expect them to take a critical approach to these scientific texts, then perhaps a tool that we could use is the focus on binary oppositions as hierarchies, right? Asking our students to think about other instances of this kind of night versus day set up in the text. Where are they present? Why do scientific writers use binary oppositions as hierarchies? What is their ideological purpose? And again, to create the open mindset, we should be asking and working with our students on suggesting alternatives that could be used and how these potentially could change the purpose or the meaning of the text. So I know I'm slightly over time, so just by way of a conclusion, I thought I'd finish with another rather unhelpful quote from Derrida. So he says, deconstruction does not aim to provide answers. I would say that we can think of deconstruction as the ongoing questioning that keeps our minds open to the idea that there may be alternative views or understandings of a text. So it's not really a method, but it is a way of thinking critically and hopefully also reading critically. And rather than seeking kind of an endpoint or a solid conclusion, I would suggest that for us and also for our students, the ongoing process of questioning could be the end in itself. Thank you very much.